This morning we have the honor of speaking with Rabbi Sami Barth, who was Senior Vice President at AJR, and you get to tell us today about the AJR world according to Barth. Tell us, how did you become involved with the Academy for Jewish Religion?
It was like so many things, it was by chance. I was a transplanted English mathematician, and I'd served a congregation in Scarsdale and Crestwood, and then JTS invited me, for reasons entirely known only to them, to come and work as the assistant dean of the rabbinical school at JTS. And during that time I lived in Westchester, and I became friendly personally with Shahama, and she heard I had become a part of the faculty community at JTS. She invited me to come and teach codes as a once-a-week class at the Academy, and I checked at JTS if anybody there really minded, and people said they really didn't mind. I was free to teach whatever and wherever I wanted, as long as it didn't impact my work at JTS. So I taught a codes class once a week at the Academy. That was at Anshe Chesed in the little room upstairs. There were about 8 students around the table. I think I was the youngest person in the room, and I reflected, I'm now receiving a kind of divine retribution. When I gave out texts with copies and little commentaries around the margin, and students said it was hard for them because of their advanced age to read the commentaries, I was probably less kind and less compassionate than I might have been. And now I can't read anything without glasses. But now on the iPad, you just squirrel your fingers and the texts get bigger, but they did not have that then. So there were about 9 students in the class, and we had a great time during the year. I have 2 academic fields I really love. One is liturgy in all its shapes and forms, but the other is, back in my own years of study at Leo Beck, I was mentored by Louis Jacobs, Zichrono Livracha, and I took 2 years out from Leo Beck College to study in yeshiva in Israel, and I developed an enormous love for Sifrut Halacha, for halachic literature and codes, which remains with me to this day. And I find it, in my mind, far more fascinating, far more of a tool of insight into the unfolding ways of Jewish thought than I find in original Talmudic and Midrashic texts. So the position I held for 3 years at JTS was funded by a specially designated grant, which did what all specially designated grants do, and it ran out. When that grant funding ran out and the position was not continued at JTS, Shahama asked me if I would think about coming on board at JTS in an administrative role. And there was a lovely synagogue that I'd become very fond of in Park Slope, and they asked me if I would consider a part-time rabbinic role with the synagogue. So beginning in 1991, I was the Dean of Academic Affairs at the Academy on a half-time basis, and the rabbi of the Park Slope Jewish Center on a half-time basis. So the Academy then had around 16 students. The first smicha that I took part in was of Louis Mintz, and the Park Slope Jewish Center had about 93 and a half dues-paying families, as far as anyone could tell. And over the next 10 years, just in summary, the Academy grew to 2 campuses, a cantorial program, and 60, 70 students. And the synagogue grew to about 240 families, and that structure was no longer viable. So the first connection was very much by chance, where Shahama, like any good dean or then president, was looking around for who would be good people to bring into the teaching community. And I think it was a good shidduch, and that's what led Shahama to think about inviting me to have a more substantial role.
You mentioned that we had expanded to 2 campuses. Do you remember where they were?
I remember the California program as the second campus, so which I know has some problematic memories connected with it. But initially, the establishment of AJR California was entirely an initiative from New York in response to some interest in Los Angeles. And although the schools and structures have have separated. Initially, it was all under the aegis of the school here in New York and the board in New York. And so my memories go from the end of the sojourn at Anshe Chesed through to the end of the sojourn at SAJ.
And when you came to AJR, did you know what to expect in terms of the pluralistic approach that we have here?
So when I first came, as I said, it was to teach one class. And Leo Baeck College, where I studied myself, is also a non-denominational school. Partly because of the name of Leo Baeck, people think that it is a structure of the Reform movement, but that is not the case. The college was originally called in London the Jewish Theological College. It was set up in the earliest days to be the descendant of the Hochschule in Germany that was destroyed during the Shoah. And Leo Baeck was then in London, and it was named and was instrumental in the earliest kind of work in establishing and creating a rabbinical school in London. And when he died several years afterwards, the school was named in his honor, but without thinking of itself as an integral creature, or if you like, or entity of the Reform movement. So Louis Jacobs, who is a vice president of the worldwide conservative movement, was the chairman of the academic committee, and the college is seen as the place to study for people who are affiliated with the liberal, the reform, or the Masorti conservative movements in England and Europe. So I was used to a school. You know, they sent me out to lead Yom Kippur services once at a British liberal synagogue that met in a church. And I think it was, I forget why, but they wanted Ne'ilah to finish about an hour and a half before sunset and have breakfast. And so that crossed my own boundaries. And and thinking about what to do about it was, you know, back when I was a student, a first exercise in pluralism. And we worked out I'd lead through Mincha and walk over to the local Hillel, and a couple of the members of the synagogue would lead Ne'ilah according to their custom and have breakfast according to their custom.
When you came to AJR in a more administrative position, what were some of the goals that you had in mind? And do you feel, what was your major contribution?
So when I came to AJR, to the extent that people at AJR now might say among themselves, as I heard you say earlier, you know, AJR isn't as well known as it could be. Nobody really knows about us. I would say you have no idea what it means for people to have no idea what AJR is. The school is enormously better known within the Jewish community now than it was then. Sadly, the reputation of AJR in the late 80s and early 90s was problematic, and there was very little by way of a fixed faculty or fixed curriculum or in any way kind of structured program and requirements. Not that those define necessarily the quality of any program, but in their absence, things are even more poorly defined. So I saw my goal as giving structure and standing and status and recognition to what I thought was the reality, but the not so well perceived reality. As I had been, I guess, an insider on the faculty and administration at JTS, I heard some sad and derogatory things said by members of the faculty at JTS. And in truth, they really didn't know. And when I said, you know, I'm a member of the faculty there now and teach, I said, how can you say that? Because they knew me or felt we had personal friendships and connections, they were willing to listen in a way that had not previously been the case. And I found that consistently, that sadly, in many, many, many different contexts in life, sometimes it's not what you are or what is there, but who you know. And at its worst, it sounds a little corrupt, But at its best, I think it's simply based on the fact that people trust what they hear when they trust and know the person from whom they hear it. So there's plus and minus, there's flip sides. And I think the people that responded to my personal invitation to teach at the Academy, that included several really great members of faculty from the seminary, including Dr. Ora Horn-Browser, who came and taught one Bible class in the early 90s, which was her first toe in the water of AJR. And it was a phenomenal class that people remembered for a long time. And I know that she brought back her memories of what it was to teach at AJR and who were the students and what were they about. And so my delight is, even if the process of accreditation isn't quite yet fully done, it is very, very well on the way. Even if there are still people out there who are not as familiar with the name or the work of the Academy as they might be, the Academy now is a really serious place. As I visit different congregations, as I have been invited to be a guest lecturer, a consultant to federations and Jewish communities, and I say I taught at the Academy, or somebody says, you know, so-and-so, their ordination is from the Academy, what can you tell us? There's an openness and a recognition that the Academy is a serious and substantial place. I came understanding what pluralism was, and I think my joy is that the Academy remains that place. It remains a place that integrates, I think, an intellectual rigor and an appreciation of scholarship, and that has a spiritual component to all of the programs and to everything that happens here, that isn't an add-on. Some people think, oh, we should really do that. But it's part of the bedrock of what the Academy is.
And have you taken that pluralism with you in your next phase of your life?
Sometimes. I think I came to the Academy with an appreciation for pluralism. All of the texts are so well known, Elu va'elu, it's all Divrei Elohim Chaim. There are contexts where I think that methodology, that approach is absolutely critical. Organizations in the Jewish community like Hillel or like military chaplaincy or hospital chaplaincy always had that embrace of pluralism. And there is, up until this moment, and I believe for a while longer, there is a place for denominations. So I have no difficulty serving as the rabbi of a conservative synagogue and teaching now at Hebrew College in Boston, which is a pluralistic institution. I don't feel that, and I spent the last 3 years as a professor at JTS, which is an avowedly denominational institution. There are real strengths in some of the understandings within a denomination. And the important piece is to know that it's a part of the spectrum, not the entirety.
So during your time at the Academy, you must have met some very interesting people, not only the administration, but some of the students. Share with us some of the characters you remember.
Some of the characters. So, Sally Owens. Do you remember Sally? So Sally was, I will confess, nobody will ever hand me the award for the most elegantly, fashionably, impeccably attired scholar of Jewish studies or rabbi in the Jewish community. Sally Owens was from Los Angeles. She flew out every Sunday, flew back to LA every Wednesday because the Academy was in New York. I think when we decided to open a branch of the Academy in Los Angeles just after she was ordained, I actually think she thought about having a contract put out to have me shot. But she never had a hair out of place, never. And walked into class, she could have walked into a fashionable cafe clutch anywhere in Hollywood, Los Angeles, or the Upper East Side. And she was the little touch of class that came into class at the academy, and always, impeccably prepared. She had in spades the intellectual and academic firepower that motivated her studies. She did an MA at what was then UJ in Los Angeles, and then came for 3 years every week on that. The same flight. It was when TWA, Oliver Shalom, still existed. And I think her regular flight crews came to her ordination after 3 years. She was always on the same plane. And there was Bonita Taylor. So even though, looking at the record, most of my hair now is closer to the salt than sand, I used to be a gingy, but Bonita was a real redhead. And if anybody here has ever been involved in raising people who are redheaded, they're not, when I say, of placid and docile disposition. So Bonita was a fiery student who simply couldn't abide to live with something that didn't feel right to her. And if it meant that putting it right, which might mean rewriting the Academy's academic bulletin that she did with me every year, and it was till midnight or 1 a.m. in the summer. But if there was a dangling participle, unconnected clause, an inconsistency between a policy on page 23 and one on page 46, she would find it, circle it in red, and put it under my face and say, "Fix this." And Shahama and I worked like crazy every year, again, before the web. So the way that the program existed from year to year was the catalog that essentially Shahama and I and Bonita edited every year. So I would have a tiny bit of good and welfare. Shahama would write a page. I would write a little page message. I still have a whole archival set, and you can see us age a little bit on the photographs from year to year. There would be a few lines from the students, and then we would describe the faculty and courses. I think the most fun I had each year was typing up the list of the faculty and who they were and where they came from. And I used to keep a running score from how many different places do our faculty derive their ordinations and teaching credentials. And the bigger that number got, the better I thought I was doing. I remember when we invited Bruce Nielsen, who was the Associate Dean of the Graduate School at JTS, and a scholar in the field of the history of Judaism and antiquity, to teach that historical period. It was not well known to everybody, given that he was a dean of the graduate school at JTS, that he was in fact an ordained Lutheran minister and not Jewish, but with phenomenal scholarly abilities in Tannaitic texts, in history of Second Temple period, in Greek and all the cognate literatures. And I think, to have somebody who was a non-Jewish religious leader teach in theology or comparative religion, students would say, yeah, we get that. But to have Second Temple Judaism taught by someone who wasn't Jewish, I think began to open their eyes to the different ways that people come to live in the same arena of scholarship. It reminded me that our teacher at Liabec College of Aramaic was a Jesuit priest, and I have his signature on my ordination diploma in Hebrew.
So it sounds like the relationship between the administration and the students was a little bit more fluid when you and Shahama were working. You mentioned the journal that you put together each year. Do you find that there was a limitation? Was there a student association at that time? What were the alumni doing for you?
So I would say, both from the years that I experienced it directly, from what I know from Shahama previously, until the mid-90s, the emergence of major power groups that were not necessarily working in harmony simply didn't exist in concept. The entirety of the academy community, the administration was 1.5 people, Shahama and me, and a bookkeeper and then Kelly part-time. There was no full-time faculty other than Shaham and myself. Everybody else were people who visited, who taught a class, which was very similar to Leobeck College when I attended it. Rabbi Jonathan Maganat, who gave several guest lectures here, was in England they call it the principal. That means president. And he was it. There were no other professors at JTS. Louis Jacobs, who I had the incredible privilege to study with. One of the things people don't know when they look at Louis's phenomenal collection of publications, he was the full-time rabbi of the 600 family synagogue with no assistant and no associate. He did all the funerals, he preached, he did all the laning. And when I was working my dissertation with him, I would go to his house at midnight and he would study with me. And he wrote all his books in longhand pencil on legal paper as an aside. And everybody who taught at Leobeck College was on that basis. So the structure at the academy was very, very familiar to me. And there were 18 and 2/3 students, a stray cat, a few alumni. There weren't many alumni because the academy was growing, so previous ordination classes had been tiny. So it was simply the academy community. There was an extraordinary sense of working together. Did students ever grumble that somebody's assignments were too long or too difficult? Sure. Did people say, I can't afford this, I don't know? So I don't want to say that it was Gan Eden and there was, like Tevi at the beginning, it was absolutely perfect without a ripple, but, he sold him a horse and said it. So it's not that there weren't ripples or moments of unhappiness or individuals in time of real personal distress, which would always introduce a level of stress and trauma into the community. But all of that aside, there was one academy community. The students, alumni, Shaham and myself, there wasn't a lot of money. So we didn't hire an editor to work on the bulletin. Benita volunteered her time. And I don't even want to count how many hours we put into it. Karen, my wife, and I used to rent a little ramshackle hut on the beach out in West Hampton for much of the summer. And with a bunch of Karen's business consulting friends would come at the weekend. And Shaham and I would go and live out there for a couple of weeks as the academy's kind of early summer retreat. And we would go over student records, we'd look at who would be coming to teach next year and write whatever policies needed to be written. And some students, some alumni would come out and stay out at the beach and work on these things. I think that it was in the late 90s that there was a more substantial drawing together of students, alumni, and the administration, with a sense that these groups were not aligned and did not necessarily share entirely an agenda or a sense of what should be done and how it should be done.
So it sounds like there were some challenges that grew up in the 90s, in the late 90s.
So people who study organizational growth will say when organizations grow from tiny size to small mid-size, you can't exactly predict exactly where or what, but that anybody who knows organizational growth will say there will be a moment where the first bubbles or the first eruptions and the first fissure happens. So, the mathematical model would be when waves or disturbances in a pond or a body of water are very small, you're going to have harmonious, smooth ripples. Throw more energy into the system, and it's impossible mathematically to predict exactly where turbulence is going to erupt, but you can predict absolutely that turbulence will erupt in the system somewhere.
So how did you handle that?
I think, with some measure of sadness, which is recognizing I could not always assume that at a meeting with alumni or students that everybody would be necessarily on the same page and looking for the best or for the ideal solution. And a little piece of it is what parents always think. If only the kids would recognize that we really do know the meaning of life. We know everything about the universe. And if everybody would just do what we say, when we say it, and the way we think that they should, everybody's life would just be so much better. And teenagers and students simply don't get it, and they have the goal to develop ideas and thoughts, and the unmitigated goal and effrontery to develop these ideas and so on of their own. So some of it I think I saw as healthy. Sadly, some parts were, I think, driven, as is almost always the case, by less than the most pure motives. There were certainly cases where I think students used opportunities they had by either becoming officers of the student association or graduating and becoming part of an alumni association to settle scores with members of the faculty community who they felt had not graded them well or made them repeat a year or delayed ordination. So there was some, I think, unfortunate score settling that went on. But on the other hand, it did put more energy into the system and make possible achieving things that would not have been possible otherwise. I think, so I didn't speak, when at the beginning in the 90s, early 90s at Anshe Chesed, there was only a rabbinical program. And people had been coming to Shahama saying, we need a similar pathway to become a chazan, to become a cantor. And I was initially dubious because the truth is the cantorial schools at HUC and JTS were not growth industries at the time. And I thought, does the world really need another cantorial program? So I think one of my in some ways, one of my greatest joys was developing the cantorial program. I think working with Ken Cohen was a unique joy. He was incredibly gifted. In addition to having been ordained at JTS, although he never finished the degree as he didn't like writing any more than I do, he'd done very formal graduate study in ethnomusicology, and he was a congregational chazan. So the early structure, and I think every so often when I look at the Academy website, it's interesting to me seeing big chunks of language that I remember writing. And I just want to give Benita the ongoing copy editing credit that I remember drafting out and thinking about and then finalizing with Benita and Shahama. And I remember the language saying the vision of the cantor is a spiritual leader who would either work, sometimes working in partnership, but who should be sufficiently well and fully trained to serve as the sole spiritual leader of a congregation. And one of my things that I've taught is a lot of people who are rabbis and cantors know very, very little about the history of the rabbinate and the cantorate. There's a wonderful book by a scholar at Bar Ilan, Eliezer Schwartzfuchs, called A Concise History of the Rabbinate, and most rabbis have never heard of it. Nobody knows who was the first rabbi. Nobody knows who invented the rabbinate. Nobody knows where it came from. And the same is largely true of the cantorate. And there is a whole body of halachic literature on shaliach tzibur. And interestingly, it says if a community has only the money to hire a rabbi or a shaliach tzibur, which should they hire? The answer is, if the rabbi, they said, is phenomenal, they should hire the rabbi. Otherwise, truly a gadol hador, otherwise they should hire a chazan, so that the melodies and rhythms of prayer are the most bedrock thing for a community to have. And I think it's an interesting text to have in mind as one thinks about the roles of modern rabbi and chazan. And so I think it was between 1991 and 92 or 93 that it moved from saying there are cantorial studies at AJR to saying we're going to give cantorial ordination. Not that anybody really knows what the word ordination means, but whatever it is, to the extent that it means anything for a rabbi, it will be parallel for a chazan. And so we would ordain people who completed that program as chazan u'morabi or chazan u'morabi Yisrael.
How long was your tenure at AJ?
It was 10 years, from 1990 through 2000, or 91 through 2001, I don't remember, something like that.
Did you notice a change in the way the Academy's culture existed during that time?
I think that the growth, which was mainly good, and the growth in numbers of students in New York, as well as the developing the second campus in Los Angeles, which was originally the LA campus was created entirely from initiative in New York in response to some people in LA, especially Stan Levy, who really wanted to see the Academy brought to LA. So I have some sadness that after the really creative, engaged work in creating an institution with a parallel mission, it saddens me that for whatever reason, the structures were unable to stay together, and that all that is now shared is a name, and I think underneath that a little sense of what the mission is about. I think that over that 10 years, the Academy changed from a small, informal, fluid community to an institution with subcultures and subgroups with similar but not absolutely identical agendas, and unfortunate personal political alignments that grew out of that. But I also think that most of the time, one of the Academy's strengths is that most of the people in the Academy will do almost anything for anybody in the system who is in some context of real difficulty or real trouble. I remember for a long time, I remember the first time it came up when a couple of people who were graduates of the Academy wanted to be admitted to the Rabbinical Assembly, the Conservative Rabbinical Association. And until the early 90s, it just wasn't happening. People would send a letter. There were 2 early cases that happened under the leadership of Wolf Kelman. And then in some way that door closed. The Rabbinical Assembly just said no. And we know, and I think that, I think it would serve the Academy well to be more outspoken on this. There are spurious and worthless rabbinical programs out there whose ordinations are like degree mills. And if they make you study for a year and come to one weekend seminar and then claim on their website, and this is proof that we're not a mail order diploma, frankly, it makes me sick. And I think that there is not enough considered and outspoken denouncing of such things in the wider Jewish community. Nobody would go to a doctor who got their medical degree on the basis of reading a few books and one weekend of study. And the Rabbinical Assembly was looking to lump the Academy in that category. And I think the personal friendships that I had, together with the work that Shahama, Benita, and I did to craft a catalog and says, these are the requirements, these are the courses, it does not exactly duplicate the program at JTS, but we weren't looking to do that. And you admit people who went to HUC whose program certainly looks nothing like the program at JTS. The issue is this a serious, well-defined program of integrity taught by people who are well qualified to teach it? And when the Rabbinical Assembly, I think, agreed, partly initially as a courtesy to me as a member, that we need to look at this and set up a committee, they agreed that ordination from the Academy would open the door for an application to membership in the Rabbinical Assembly. They didn't guarantee to accept anyone, as they don't guarantee to accept anyone from anywhere other than JTS, but being ordained by the Academy would open that door. That was not a small thing, and I was absolutely thrilled to have some share in making it happen. The other stick that they used to beat us with was, well, HUC and JTS have academic accreditation. And so that was when in about what year is this? Okay, so the issue of getting academic accreditation has now been on the HAR agenda for about 22 years. And I remember when it started, and Shahama and I looked at each other and said, duh, now what do we do? So we did what you do when you don't know the immortal worlds of Rumsfeld, when you don't even know what it is that you don't know that you don't know. You hire a consultant. So we got an accreditation consultant. Such creatures do indeed exist. Robert Montgomery, PhD, who was an absolute delight. He had supported a number of small institutions, not in any way in Jewish studies, in skating their way through the requirements of New York State and Middle States to gain accreditation. And he would say, sometimes skating on very, very thin ice. He said his name was well known in the corridors of Albany and the offices that deal with this thing. And he said, it's another Montgomery application coming down the pike. And some of the things he said we kind of knew, but as it says in one of the good books, Ein Navi Be'iro, nobody's a prophet in their own town. By the way, you know that that's from the Gospels, not the Tanakh. So it was a little leverage on the board. Each year we raised a tiny bit more money than the previous year. And the board, all on its own, would not have listened to me and Shahama if we said we need to hire a professor. They would have said, let's pay some of the people who are working for us a little more. Let's bring in 4 more adjunct teachers and have a greater diversity of courses. Montgomery really pounded the table, or he pounded us, and then we pounded the table with the board to say, if you want to take yourself seriously and to be seen seriously, you need 2 things. You need a library and you need professors. You need full-time faculty whose primary allegiance is to HAR as an institution. And because it was said by a consultant as opposed to by Shahama and myself, the board made some heroic efforts, got a couple of people to make contributions, and I was authorized as academic dean to advertise for a professor. And the result of that first search for an academic appointment at HAR was appointing Ora Horn-Browser as professor of Bible. And that was, the fondness with which we saw her application when she when she came was based on the earlier course that she had taught when I simply invited her to come teach a single course on lying and falsity in biblical narrative. So when I was working at JTS, one of my assignments was to revamp the professional training, and we got a bunch of senior rabbis in the tri-state area to agree to be mentors to JTS students. Bill was one of them, and we ran a couple of, these were some of those cantankerous, senior, untrainable bunch of people you could ever want to meet. And they were entirely resistant to the idea that anyone could teach them anything about the rabbinate. We had at JTS a consultant in field supervision who was the associate dean of the social work school at Columbia called Jackie Mundras, who was 4'11.5" and ferocious. And after a year, she had all of these senior rabbis eating out of her hand, including Bill. And I remember kidding around with Bill because he was a tough guy from a tough neighborhood. So I have a background in karate and he was a boxer, and we would mess around at retreats. So I got to know, he spoke about his daughter Ora, who was teaching at JTS. So that was the connection. So when we advertised this position, Ora called me and she said, "Sami, should I be applying for this?" And I said, "Ora, absolutely, send a letter and a resume." And she was, as it says in the Bible, which is fitting for her, head and shoulders, existentially, if not in feet and inches, above everybody else who applied. And so she became the Academy's first academic appointment. And that was the beginning of seriously putting our feet on that long yellow brick road to getting authority to award degrees and accreditation. Is it really necessary? I don't know, but it's certainly politically very helpful. Oh, one other thing that I really loved, and it spanned transition. Karen, my wife, is a management strategic planning consultant, and she has a real interest in and love for the rabbinate and rabbinical training. She helped the Academy write its first strategic plan, and where the software didn't even exist. I remember we drew the bar charts by hand on where we wanted enrollment and budget and numbers of faculty and so on to be. After that, she was hired by JTS to do a strategic plan, and by Hebrew Union College subsequently to be the process consultant for the entire revision of their rabbinic and cantorial programming. After that, she felt that there were issues in common to every seminary, and she got the Cummings Foundation to underwrite a 3-day retreat for the deans of all rabbinical schools. And there was a big fight about who would be in and who would be out. So obviously, JTS, HUC, and RSC were in. They did not want AJR to be in originally. And Karen pressed very hard and said, look, I got the money for this. So AJR was included, and so was the Aleph ordination program, which Hammer and I both remained very active in. Leo Baeck College was involved. YU wouldn't come, but Chavavei Torah came. And it was a fascinating 3-day retreat. And there was some really excellent programming, but even more was just really building personal relationships. And then it was repeated only one subsequent time, either 2 or 3 years later, and then Shahama had retired. I came then as a representative. I'd also moved on from Aleph, and the Academy was represented by Ora, and I forget who the second Academy representative was. But it's fascinating. I've got the participant photographs from both of those gatherings, looking at who was there. But some of the relationships of great fondness that were built between and among deans then, I think to this day continue to serve all the institutions well.
So you served long and well, and you really moved the Academy from one phase of its existence to another, and you saw the changes and the ripples and all those other effects. What's your connection with us now?
So every seminary, and we always got at the Academy, requests from people who said, I already know a lot. I'm already the acting rabbi. I've already been working as the chazan of a synagogue. I know everything up the wazoo and back. Let me get through quickly. Anybody who runs any program, the always desire students is, show me a list of the requirements. How many of these can I get out of or get exempted from? And we had to deal with that continuously at the Academy. One thing which I remember just grew out of a late night conversation with Shahama and took a year to pilot through was what I think is still on the books, the accelerated program. We said, let's recognize that there are people and so let's design a really serious list of qualifications, which means you have to have served in a very senior capacity in the Jewish world. You have to already hold a master's degree. You have to be able to pass our exemption exams in Talmud, codes, Hebrew language, and Bible. And if someone can really do all of that as the way into the Academy, then we will put in place 2 years of full-time study, which clearly a person might spread over 3 or 4. But a program based on 2 years of study, if there is a truly substantial, credible, rigorous background that qualifies a person to enter, I think it's right and proper that that exists. It's unfortunate, I think, that I only know of 2 cases in 20 years where JTS waived its regulations to allow such a thing to happen. I think it's the right thing, and I think it serves the Jewish community well to take people who are credible and give them what I think is an honest pathway to ordination that has integrity and credibility. And it's knowing that that structure is in place that means I have no patience with people who obtain these spurious mail order ordinations saying, I know this is worthless, we all know it's worthless, but I was sitting here in Florida or in Arizona and I really had no choice. I couldn't go to JTS for 5 years. I would say, you could have made it to complete this program through the academy and earned an ordination that has integrity, rather than I believe people, and some of them are very good, but I feel that they lessen themselves by allowing themselves to receive a credential and a title that they know in their heart is worthless.
So you have brought a great deal of love and energy and passion to your work with the Academy and your continued friendship with people who you've met at the Academy. What is your hope and what is your prayer for us going forward?
I think the hope and prayer, you can't help, there's a little story in the background. I never had the privilege to study with Saul Lieberman at JTS. I met him once, and I understand, and the stories are legion, that it was not necessarily an experience of peace, love, and harmony to be in Lieberman's class, but he was a master scholar. And if I understand rightly, the story is, he said, if you want to do a textual emendation, how do you know that you got it right? When everybody says, oh, that's obvious. Oh, you know, that's nothing. And it might be a work of genius to think of it. So as long as the Academy thinks of itself as we are in the process of creating something new and special, nobody knows about us, we have to put ourselves out there. We'll know the work is done when people says, oh yeah, of course, you went to HAR, no big deal. There's a lot of schools out there. The rabbinate is a very challenged and challenging place, and the cantorate, the paradigms of the kinds of jobs that rabbis and cantors used to have, is rapidly, rapidly going away. And frankly, I think that some of the flexibility of structure the Academy has lets the Academy, and I think somewhat similarly for Aleph and for Hebrew College, more than HUC and JTS, these newer institutions, I think, embrace the possibility of being far more responsive and cognizant of what's changing, because it's not a small thing. Synagogues are going under all the time. Jews don't want to be denominational Jews anymore. You asked me about the denominational thing earlier, and I said until now, and maybe for a little longer, the denominational model serves well. But the biggest way, as we all know, when you ask Jews how they define themselves, the biggest affiliation is the JJ, just Jewish. People don't think of themselves as Reform Conservative, whatever, yada, yada. And the academies, maybe the Academy should call itself the JJ of the Just Jewish Rabbinical School. But it shouldn't be remarkable. When the Academy isn't remarkable anymore, I think the things that Shaham and I dreamed about, I think we'll say, you know, it's done, let's move on.